Hello, teachers from around the world, and welcome to Legendary Educator, the podcast that helps you improve your performance in the classroom and have more engaged and motivated students. My name is Ramis Takawi. I'm a teacher and instructional coach, and I created this podcast because I'm passionate about education and about students achieving their highest potential. During Veterans Day in the United States and Remembrance Day in Canada, people are celebrating the end of the Great War and honoring those who lost their lives and continue to lose their lives in battle. Our young students are also celebrating these events and attending ceremonies organized by their schools, while not really knowing why or what they are celebrating. Meanwhile, on the news, war still rages on in different parts of the world, and our children are inevitably overhearing the gruesome details on the news or on their social media feeds. This week on Legendary Educator, I'll be discussing war in the classroom with my guest and asking when it is appropriate to start introducing topics relating to war to our students. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss any future episodes as they drop. All right, let's get to know our guest this week.
All right. Hello, my name is E. Scott England. There's a reason the E is so important there. My students call me Mr. England or Dr. England. It really depends what setting I'm in. I answer to either. I'm currently, though, assistant professor at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, a top 10 public historically Black college university in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And I've been in education, it seems like a long time, but really, I think it's only been 16 years. I got started late in the game, I suppose. My favorite teacher when I was a child, actually, I got to change it. My favorite teacher still is Mrs. Kazel. She's 80 plus, and I just had the opportunity to run into her the other day. But she is my favorite teacher because of the way I felt in her classroom as a first grader, and the way still when I talk to her, when I run into her at the grocery store or something, I feel like the lights in the store go off and it's just a spotlight on me. That's how Mrs. Kazel makes me feel. And it's amazing to watch her just, she can work a room, because then you go and you watch her talk to somebody else and it's like the spotlight's on them, and you can tell like she is focused on them. And she did that as a first grade teacher. She's done that through my adult life. She was hugely impactful to me becoming an educator. Maybe we'll get into telling a little bit more about how I got into education late, and just how Mrs. Kazel, after so many years of no communication, came back to play a huge role in me becoming a teacher.
I thank you for your time and the opportunity. I know you're a busy man. I've got a burning question that has been on my mind for a couple of days, actually more like a couple of weeks. I'm going to save that question, though. And as always, I'm going to ask you for your origin story. How did you join this wacky world of education? I'm going to be honest with you. I've heard your podcast a couple of times, which we're going to mention later on. You're much younger than I pictured you.
Yeah, well, I
you're much younger
that.
than I pictured. Now that I see you on Zoom, and you are a PhD or a professor of education, I want to know your origin story. How did you get here?
No, I appreciate that. I love when people ask me my origin story, just the same as I love to ask others about theirs, because you know what, we all took different roads to run the same race. And mine, I in the opening I said Mrs. Kazel in first grade, she one of two reasons I became a teacher. So I had a second grade teacher, this would have been the year after Mrs. Kazel, who was the worst teacher I've ever had, made me feel just absolutely lower than low as a second grader. So imagine, like I'm what, 8 years old, and that's how an 8-year-old feels. So those two teachers were the reason that I got into education, because I had the best, and I wanted my students, and I wanted students to have the opportunity to just be loved the way that Mrs. Kazel loved her students. And I wanted to make sure that no student of mine ever went through what I had to go through in second grade. And so as I went through, the thing is, I didn't think I would be an elementary teacher. I've always loved to write. I've loved just literature, poetry, all of that. That's really in high school.
Yeah, high
Those were the
school lit.
only
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, those were the only classes I really excelled at in
Mm,
high school. Like I wasn't a great student, and so I thought, okay, I'll become a teacher, and I wanted to be a high school English teacher, and that was the goal. And so after high school, I went to community college, and I was still a really I say terrible student. That sounds bad, but I didn't excel, right? I didn't have
mm.
anybody that really looked at me, and I never had somebody that said, you can do it if you would just apply yourself. Instead, I had the high school counselor who, when I told him I wanted to take college prep classes, said, "You're not really college material. You ought to
Oh
probably look at a
no.
vocational route."
Mm,
And so like that always stuck with me. And so I did. I struggled. Like I had a GPA less than 3 when I finished community college, and I was accepted into a 4 year. It was really, university known for teaching, and after like a semester, I didn't even make it through a semester. I'm just like, I can't do this because in the back of my head, other than Mrs. Kazel, which it had been a long time removed since first grade, I
mm.
didn't have anybody that said, "Hey, Scott, you can do this." And so I quit school and I went to work in a factory. I
Oh
got
wow.
married. I jumped around. Like I love factory work. It's still been maybe some of the funnest work. Just because it's that hands-on kind of thing. And but I worked TV stations and really kind of tried to find myself. And then I had my firstborn, and it was in that when I had the opportunity to really see how impactful we can be on the lives of others.
Mm,
And for me it was my son. And so I we had moved to Minnesota, back to Illinois. I was working, actually I'd left a factory. I was working for a trucking company, not as a truck driver but as a driver manager. And it was a pretty bad experience. My wife had heard on the radio an advertisement for a professional adult accelerated education program at a local university, and it was night classes. And if you were automatically, if you had an associate's, which I did, the only caveat was you had to do it in elementary education. Secondary wasn't an option.
mm.
And I thought, you know what? That's when I really thought back to Mrs. Kazel. My son was going to be in just a year after I started. He was going to be in kindergarten. I thought, all right, you know what? I can see myself as like fifth grade teacher and everything. And so we got started in that, went through the classes. It came time for the student teaching experience, and
Mm.
they could not find a placement for me. And finally, they tried. Everybody else in my classes, and my cohort had been placed. I hadn't been placed. I thought, my goodness, it's just going to derail right here. And then one day I get an email, or maybe it was a phone call, and from the student teacher coordinator, the placement coordinator from the university. And she said, "All right, I have you a placement, and I hope it's okay. It's the town that you live in." I'm like, "Oh, that'll be fine." Because originally they said I wouldn't be able to do that because my son
Mm.
was going to be in kindergarten.
Mm.
And they're like, "Okay, well, you're going to student teach in first grade, and your cooperating teacher will be Mrs. Kazel."
I knew it was coming.
Yeah, yeah. Because it's like if Hallmark made a movie for education,
Yeah,
that's it, right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
And so Mrs. Kazel and I were reunited, and I
Mm,
student taught with her for 14 weeks, and she was very instrumental in. I finished student teaching on a Friday in November,
mm.
and there was an opening at a nearby school district for a first grade teacher of all things.
There you go.
And the only thing was, it was started the Monday after I finished student teaching. So I had a weekend off, then took over my first class. Like I didn't even have my teaching license yet. And the school that hired me, they're like, "Hey, if you don't ask questions, we won't ask." I'm like, "Okay, you do
Mm,
whatever you need to do." But
mm,
so I taught first grade like immediately in that. And then after a year, I loved teaching in that first school. But I got a phone call towards the end of that first year of teaching, and they said, "Hey, Mrs. Kazel's retiring. We would like for you to apply to her position."
mm.
And so I applied, and I took over Mrs. Kazel's classroom.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I went back and I taught in my home community for a few years before I became principal, superintendent, and then so on and so on. But the origin, that's it. It's a little probably more than you bargained for, but man, I'm so proud of the story. I'm proud of everything. I'm proud that I did not finish 4-year university. I'm proud that I went to work in factories and TV stations. I have so much experience that I've brought into education at all different levels. And I really, I thought I would always get my doctorate. Like that was always a plan. Like I really thought I would have it before 30. And I was after, I was over 30 when I got it. And so,
It's okay.
but I always wanted to, I always wanted to be in higher education. I thought I'd be in higher education, before a certain age, and I'm not, I'm over 40, but here I am now. And so, but I don't know. It's so much fun just being in education. Like I think all the time, like sometimes I think, man, I would just love to go back to the elementary classroom and just teach those kids, because they're so energetic. They make me feel energetic and everything. So I love being in this profession.
When was the transition from an elementary teacher to a PhD professor?
Yeah. So I was, and this is where I kind of I regret a little bit in how I accelerated myself, because there was,
you went too fast.
Yeah. And while I'm proud of like my origin story, what happened was once I became an elementary teacher, then I began thinking I'm really behind. I'm behind where I thought I would be, and so I taught first grade for 4 years and then became an elementary principal.
Oh, that's
And
fast.
I was, so I was an elementary principal for 3 years, and I became a district superintendent.
Wow.
And so I was on the brink of burning out of education. When the pandemic hit, I was a superintendent. And, for the first 6 months, it was fine because it was new for everybody, and everybody was kind of like, arms linked, we're in this together. But after like 6 months, when community members got tired of like the kids being home and all of this, like it became kind of very politicized in my community that I was in. And I was 37, I believe. I was 37 years old, and I was on 2 blood pressure medications. And I remember it was in December, and I just get up in the morning, I take my blood pressure medicine. I thought, I mean, sometimes we have to, right? There's nothing against if you have to take blood pressure medicine at 37, but mine was because of what I was
doing. Right?
Yeah, and so I did have control over that, and then it became more polarized within the community. And I had just signed a new 4-year contract with the school district, and I was 1 year into that new 4-year contract, and I said I can't do it. I can't continue on, not in this environment. And so I actually stepped down as superintendent. I moved 5 hours away to a community I'd never been, and I became a 3rd grade teacher for 1 year. And I went back to the elementary classroom from superintendent. And at first, like I had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, like, how am I going to be perceived? Right. But then ultimately I thought, who cares? Like I know why I'm here, and I'm having the best year of my life,
of course,
teaching 3rd grade in a new community. And it was so refreshing. And I probably would have still been there, but I got the opportunity to transition to higher education, and it was something that I've always wanted to do. I've wanted to be able to say that I've been a professor, and so I made that transition. Now I've been in higher education for 2 years.
Okay, good. So you are now a professor of education.
Education leadership.
Okay, so I think you are the best person to ask about what I want to ask.
All right.
As you know, the past couple of weeks, the past couple of months, the past couple of years, we have been entrenched in war. The Ukraine war and the Israel-Palestinian war, and then going back, you got the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, and then today, it's a Friday today. Every Friday, I volunteer at my kids' school. My kids are also grade 1. And I mean, coincidentally, today they had a ceremony for the Remembrance Day. And they're talking about peace, and they're talking about, war, and they're talking about, sacrifice, all good stuff. But I'm looking around with my teacher vision, right? With my teacher goggles.
Yeah.
All the kids are either staring at the ground, or they're staring blankly, or they're looking around, or they're biting their nails, or they're playing with their friend's hair. They're not, in it. The awareness isn't there. Like, what are you talking about? I don't know what a war is. I don't know what peace is. I don't know what remembering. I'm like, what are we remembering? I don't know. Which brings me to my question. Is it appropriate, number one, to bring war into the classroom? If it is, at what level? How young are we talking? My kids, grade 1, I watch the news. I like to keep up with the war here and there. But every time they enter the room, I change the channel because what they see on TV is pretty horrific, right? It's the stuff of nightmares. At what age is it appropriate, if at all, to introduce them to, such things as war and current events and sacrifice and death and politics, and if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, it's one in which, we could definitely, you could poll 10 people and get 10, different responses. And so, but here's what I say. Yes, you have to, I think, as an educator, bring that into the classroom at an appropriate level. And we'll get back to appropriate level in just a second. But here's why I think that you can't ignore it, because while you say that you watch and keep updated, and then your kids walk in, you turn off the TV. Not everybody can say that, and I think too many times our youngest are exposed to conversations, to situations, and everything else through overhearing adults or overhearing the television or something that they're getting it on a very inappropriate level because of what's being said around non-educator adults. Like you said, you've mentioned your educator vision, right? So when your kids come in, that clicks in. You don't want them to be exposed to that same thing. But knowing that you've got a very diverse group of students that come into your classroom, that to pretend that something's not happening within our world, within our community, I think that it's dangerous to pretend that doesn't exist. And again, like, we try to monitor what our children see on social media, but not everybody does that. And so, I think more so ever than before, our children today are being exposed to stuff that, it's unfathomable when it comes to, the language, the violence, the inappropriate adult content,
the images.
Like, it's out there. And so I think that to just completely ignore it would probably be irresponsible. But then the second part would be the appropriateness, right? And so, I think that it's important that from very early on, at a great appropriate level, we have conversations about things that have gone on. And I'll use 9/11 as an example here for students, because clearly that is a horrendous event that happened in United States history. But to pretend through kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, all the way up, that it didn't happen until you get to a certain age, like, that doesn't work. Like, it did happen. And so I think, like, for those kindergarten, no, we're not going to focus on the 3,000 plus people that died, but instead we're going to focus on the heroics of our first responders. And then the second year, as they get into first grade, we build upon the heroics of the first responders, and then we add another little piece. And so then we're talking these current events, we're talking these historical past events in a way that's scaffolded to where they get the information, but it's at an appropriate level. Like, and I see all the time where I believe, in my opinion, some educators mess up and they show images of 9/11. There's a very famed image of like the falling man, I believe is what they call it. that's probably not an appropriate image to show in an elementary classroom. But as you work your way up in high school, maybe that is an appropriate place to address it in there. But I do think that you have to have these ongoing conversations, because if you don't, and we can use like the Israel Palestine kind of conflict right now. If we don't give an opportunity to have conversations within the classroom, then we could have uncontrolled conversations,
Outside.
debates, and everything else on the playgrounds.
Right.
And so if I have, say two elementary students, and elementary could be, anything. So we can say third grade, fourth grade, but where they're able to form opinions and everything else. If we don't give them the opportunity to have that platform within our classroom where it's controlled and we can, really kind of moderate, then we're really setting the stage for an unmoderated, outside of our classroom. So I that's where I kind of stand on that.
I mean, again, to contrast what I was thinking as a former history teacher, we were talking about, in Canada, tomorrow's Remembrance Day, it's November 11, right? It's very famous. And we bring up World War I in a high school history class. So we're having ceremonies, Remembrance Day ceremonies, and we're talking about a war that these kids are oblivious to until they reach high school, maybe upper middle school. I'm not sure. I was a high school teacher, right? And so they're oblivious to it until they reach high school. And then if they're lucky, they're going to sort of make the like match of, okay, Remembrance Day is about World War I and all wars after. But right now, if they're oblivious to this war or the idea of war, and I want to be careful how to ask this question, because obviously having a ceremony about Remembrance Day and the sacrifices is very noble, but is it pointless?
Yeah. Well, I think that and going back, it's definitely hard to because we don't have anybody that is from World War I that we can put before. But I think just in being able to understand the significance of why we serve, why people served, I think that's where it comes in. In Illinois, we live right across the street from the school, and so tomorrow is Veterans Day, and so all of the schools are doing their Veterans Day program today. And I know, because I had to run to the store, and like I could not turn into the parking lot because or into the road because the Veterans Day program had gotten out. But I think it's important that just because we weren't there in the past, we still need to be able to recognize those who have that knowledge. And because otherwise, then if we're not recognizing the sacrifice that people made, say, in World War I, and then at what point do we say, well, let's quit teaching it? And if we quit teaching it, then we're beginning to erase history. But that's just why I think that is still the importance of having that, because
the ceremony, right? Having a ceremony at an elementary school about something they don't know anything about.
Yeah, well, I think that we could definitely do better. And why have it just one day? Why can't we incorporate that into our curriculum where it's all the time? I think it would stick a lot more. The concepts that I remember from my formative years in education are the ones in which we had constant practice and introduction to, and we revisited, versus the ones that was a one-off shot. And I think too many times we, and especially in our history classes, and I'm working with a doctoral student right now who is a social studies teacher in a Metro East area, and his whole thing is that social studies is part of the core curriculum. So why don't we recognize it as such? Because it always takes a back seat to English language arts. It takes a back seat to math, as does so many other things. Well, so we need to make sure that we give it the proper recognition and value, and part of that, I think, would help these ceremonies that we have, and understanding why we're having that ceremony. Because for how many kids did you see sitting in there today will not have the opportunity to engage in this discussion until November 9th, 10th, 11th of next year? And so I think that's the thing that we've got to do better at is really cause for understanding and giving opportunity for ongoing conversations.
So again, the burning question of the burning question is, how do I do that? How do I introduce this in my classroom, elementary classroom? High school has their high school, history classes. They talk about war all the time and the weapons and the deaths and the tactics and the winners and the losers, right? How do I introduce war and conflict and Remembrance Day and all the stuff that is still ingrained in our history, in our culture, in our society at a young age?
And I think that a lot of this can go back onto our administrator of elementary schools and, giving the opportunity for classrooms to have the social studies in the day. Because I know as an elementary teacher, 4 years in first grade, 1 year in third grade, the emphasis again is on ELA and math.
Yeah.
And so, but I think what is important, and so I did this more in third grade, and I think that maybe this helps answer the question, is that in third grade, we really we combined the social studies and ELA together. So, it was more of like a social studies content using ELA concepts as far as reading goes and, reading for understanding, main idea, and all of that.
Right.
But while we didn't necessarily address, some of the the major wars and everything, what we did is we talked about, the conflicts of the Roman Empire, the Julius Caesar days. We talked about, so we go way back to understand, like there was brutality in that. There was killing, people died, to begin kind of that first step of having those conversations that, this didn't just happen back when. It wasn't just when Vikings pillaged, but it continued to build. And so, but the thing is, to get that in the regular classroom, you have to have an entire school on board. You can't rely on, third grade's doing a good job, but then when they get to fourth grade, they don't address it at all. And I think that's where a really good, strong curriculum and also scope and sequence within a social studies is on board, and somebody's got an oversight to see that. So, because how many times in high school is your history teacher teaching multiple grade levels, and so they know that, okay, I taught the sophomores this, and when I have juniors come in, I know that they got it because I taught it.
Right.
And I think that if you want to see the ongoing conversation where you make it relevant and you have where it's an important topic, you've got to have that vertical alignment as they go throughout the grade. You can't just let one all-star teacher be the one that introduces the concepts and gives it to them on an age appropriate level. It's got to be something that the school is behind. You understand what it is, and then teachers are talking and sharing.
Okay, so it can't be a one-off thing. It can't be, okay, this is one lesson about this particular thing, then we forget about it and we move on. Then the next years it's forgotten all the way until you reach high school, and now all of a sudden it's a part of the history curriculum. This is World War I, this is World War II, this is that, this is this, and it's it's the first time they're hearing about it.
Yeah, and to add to that, if you don't have that vertical integration within your elementary school, then what you potentially have, and I think we have it a lot, is that you're just teaching the same thing year after year. And rather than introducing a new conflict or a new, this is why. And I think a lot of times, we don't introduce it because we're not comfortable with it. I know that's a lot of conversation I've had, with talking about slavery and kind of the 1800s and all that, well, I don't feel comfortable teaching slavery, so I don't. Well, that's not an excuse. Like, if you're not comfortable because of your background, and what your culture is and teaching it, then you need to be able to go out, find the resources yourself. But you can't deprive students because you're not comfortable with it, or because I think of the teachers that aren't comfortable with war and conflict. Like, no, I don't think anybody's comfortable with war and conflict, but but it's not an excuse to deprive our students of that. And so, I put a lot back on teachers.
Okay. So in summary, it is a good idea to introduce this in a classroom at a younger age appropriately, right? So I'm not, telling them all about the bad stuff, but at least I'm putting foundational elements about conflict. Conflict exists in the world without going too much into detail about the number of deaths, the number of this, number of that. But as long as they understand that what is the definition of a war, what is the definition of conflict, and I guess what peace means, right? That we're all sort of, celebrating on these holidays. What am I celebrating? I don't even know what I'm celebrating, right?
Right. Absolutely.
And again, age appropriately is the magic word.
Yeah. And I mean, not going into, like you said, the details of the numbers of things, but that's by not going into those details, you're also giving the power of inferring, which is one of our standards in English language arts anyway, right? That we have the power to infer. And so, I think that I can infer if, one side bombs the building of another side in a residential area, there's probably death, right? And so I don't have to go into the gory details of it or the numbers. Now I can infer.
Okay. In a minute or less, you also have a podcast. You have a magical voice.
Oh, wow.
And it's also for teachers. Can you tell me a little bit more about your podcast? What are its objectives?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the podcast. So my podcast is Anchored in Education. And really the whole idea is that, regardless of where we are in education, as far as grade level goes or role, title, whatever it may be, at the end of the day, we're all anchored in education, whether we agree, we disagree, just having that ongoing conversation. So when I have episodes that are ongoing, new episodes every Monday. Right now we're in hiatus because of just life, but I usually feature different guests that and a different topic and then somehow tie it in to education. Really, I've had so many guests that have come to me and said, I'd love to be on your podcast, but I'm not an educator. It doesn't matter. Even for those that have never been formally an educator, we're anchored in education. We all have a background story that involves education in some way, shape, or form, positive, negative, anything in between. So that is the whole idea behind Anchored in Education. And it's been a blessing to do 100+ episodes of it. And I'm really hoping that time kind of goes on my side here coming up, because I've got a lot of great episodes in the hopper just waiting to be produced and put out for the world to see.
I thank you for your time and the opportunity. I know you're a busy man.
Yeah, Mr. Ramos, it was a pleasure being on your podcast today. And I love the questions. I love anything that makes me think. And I love to talk education. And Legendary Educator has definitely given a platform for others to engage in that conversation. So I hope to we can revisit again, talk some more, but just keep doing the great things you're doing. Thanks.
That's our show for today. Comment and let me know whether you've discussed these topics with your students and how they felt about these discussions. Don't forget to share this episode with your teacher friends who might benefit from listening to it. And also rate this episode and subscribe to the podcast. I'm Ramis Takawi, and this is Legendary Educator. Thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you next time.